Hey again, Ethics Module 3. We're looking at Woody Chapters 4 and 5. There will be a break after Woody Chapter 4 and 5. We'll start back up with Sprinkle, page 30 to 183. So this module will have two different videos, guys. Looking at Chapter 4, Relationships with Others. The first thing in the syllabus that it talks about is a traditional view of ethics compared to and contrasted with a postmodern view. Page 62. If you're looking at Anderson, Gergen, Swim, it's an alternative view of ethics. Kind of a traditional view is the letter of the law. What does the ethics code actually say? A postmodern view is very much more centered on aspirational, virtual, principle, moral ethics, and social constructiveness. What is the cultural, contextual, environmental worldview of your client, supervisee, employee, student, the person that's at the basis of the ethical dilemma, and how do you meet those people with those overlays? So looking at those things, I would refer you back to the article, the Transcultural Ethical Decision-Making article by Cartwright and Garcia. Look at that article, look at the ethical decision-making model with the cultural overlay for every general principle. It's in the Google Drive. Secondarily, the point of view of different stakeholders in the ethical dilemma. Again, if you're looking at the professional stakeholders, how is the profession going to be affected? The clinical, what happens between you and the client? The ethical, what does the ethics code say? Are you going to be pulled up to an ethics review meeting before a committee? Legal, what does the law say? Are you going to be in danger of going to court? Family relational, how does this affect the client's family? How does this affect you personally, you professionally as a clinician? How does this affect you when there's not a clear-cut decision-making process, which is almost always the situation? There wouldn't be ethical dilemmas if you could look in the ethics code and the legal code and just say, this is it. It's always a gray area. So look carefully, if you look at page 63 and 64, look carefully at all of the people, look at the ethics codes and what it says about supervising, about teaching with students, about collaborating with other professionals, and what you do with clients in the clinical practice. And those guidelines are there to help you facilitate the values. Ethics are value-laden at best and at worst. Examine your own before you make a decision. Looking for areas to cover in contracts between supervisors and supervisees. We'll have a sample contract for supervisees for you. Read the case examples that are on page 63 when rights collide. Because the thing that makes it an ethical dilemma is what's good for your client may not be good for their family. What is legally correct may not fully express the ethical code that you live by and practice by. So read those things. Remember the foundational principles. Beneficence, do your clients good. Non-maleficence, at best avoid doing them harm. Autonomy, respecting their right to choose without our values being imposed. Justice, which is honesty and fairness. Fidelity, which is truthfulness with the client. Faithfulness to the profession and to the practice. So page 66 and 67, is it important to have an informed consent for supervisees and students? The answer to the question is yes. And the informed consent in that particular situation is loosely understood to be the contract. The contract should talk about multiple relationships. It's pretty clear for us that we would not have a client who's also a student or a client who's also a supervisee. However, when you are looking at supervisees who are also students, supervisees who are also employees, That's where it gets sticky, because when we are supervising our employees, quite frequently it goes to administrative versus clinical. Administrative, what is right for this practice? Did you get your progress notes, your treatment notes, plans in? Did you get all your charts completed? Did you see all your clients at an acceptable productivity rate? Those things. But with clinical supervision, it's did you grow personally and professionally? Very difficult. Many practices, including this one, have tried to solve that issue by having a person who is an administrative supervisor, where that role is very clearly defined, that I'm here to protect the interest of the practice. And a clinical supervisor, his role is to protect the interest of the employee/supervisee. Always remember that once a termination of an employee occurs, that supervision relationship is also terminated. That is a multiple dual relationship. And if you have accepted that person as an employee and accepted that person as a student, a supervisee, and the employee status ends and maybe doesn't end well, where do your responsibilities lie to that person as a supervisee? Because even if they were not the kind of employee you might have wanted them to be, that doesn't mean that you take all of the supervision that they've been offered, whether they paid for it or not, because it's understood that they are getting that as a benefit of their employment. All of that doesn't go away. We're still legally responsible to give them the number of supervision hours that they have, or give them a transcript credit for the courses that they've taken. And those things can't just be taken away in some kind of blanket format. You weren't a good employee, therefore you deserve no supervision and you've lost all your credit for classes. Very clear delineation of roles and responsibilities and rules have to be set out front. So take time to look at the articles and the supervisee contracts that are there. And that in there is Woody 67 to 69, kind of gives you an example of the supervisor-supervisee relationship situation. In the contract, it will very clearly spell out self-disclosure about your credentials, your ability, your competency to supervise. What you will offer. It's a contract, a legally binding contract. What am I going to give you? The number of hours that are required to meet your licensure requirements. What are you going to do? Show up, be on time, be prepared, have something to staff, make your payments. What do we do when there's a grievance? How do we resolve problems? How do we approach? What are the contact numbers? What are your rights? If I evaluate you, do you have the right to evaluate me? The answer to these things is in good supervision. The answer is yes. So look at those. It says on 69, suggested guidelines: prepare for the worst, hope for the best. Not a bad practice. The sub-principle on page 70 to 71 related to the process of coordinating treatment and other professionals is, let's see if I can see where it's at. Sub-principle 4.7. You do not share information that could reasonably lead to the identification of a client or research participant or a supervisee. We have the responsibility to protect their anonymity. They still have confidentiality. We can exchange information according to sub-principle 2.6 with individuals who share an educational and training responsibility. HIPAA codes allow us to share some information among other clinical professionals, understanding that they are under the same HIPAA requirements of confidentiality. So if you have a supervisee and a student in your class, you can disclose some of their information if you have a teaching assistant who's working on the class, or you have an administrative supervisor who's working on their administrative skills within the agency while you work on the clinical skills. So those things are allowed, but check yourself, check the situations and the relationships, make sure that you've mentioned this, that it's documented in the written contract that these things will be disclosed and shared and have it signed and dated prior to any of those things occurring. Respectful collaboration on page 71. There is a case example there. If you are collaborating with peers, colleagues, and remember that every supervisee coming up is a rising colleague. They're not going to remain your supervisee. Once a client, always a client. But supervisees have a way of becoming fully licensed and joining the professional field at some type of level of parity. So the way that we treat them as they go up the ladder is important. Explain it to them. Realize they don't have the body of knowledge that you have. It's not that they're incapable. It's not that they haven't done their part or they haven't tried to learn. Some of it is a function of experience and a lack of full knowledge base. Approach that situation respectfully. Storm's best practices for supervision, Woody, page 74 and 75. Are here on a table. Supervision in general. Looking at that table, number one, understand the gatekeeping principle. That we are to be maximally effective, and while we want to support the rising colleague, our first responsibility always is to protect the interest of clients, the families, the community. We're agreeing to assume the role of their supervisor. We're ready, should be ready and able to have specifics of the supervision process ready for them, written, formal, legal contracts, periodically reviewed, and have someone who's helping to oversee our caseload and for best practices that we are making sure that they're getting the correct kind of feedback. For feedback for supervisees, it can be informal, verbal, that is formative during the process. At the end, it is written, it is formal, it is structured, it is summative at the end of the process. Contextual sensitivity, just meeting them where they are culturally, contextually, in their environment, understanding that people are diverse from us as they come in, and what we need to do to bridge that gap. Wherever the power differential is, that person who holds that power differential is the person responsible for bridging it to those who have less power in the situation. A supervision philosophy, there should be a philosophy. We have one that is a written philosophy of what we understand about the agencies of change. The supervision relationship, just like one of the greatest agencies of change from the client and a counselor is the therapeutic relationship, one of the greatest indicators for positive change in supervision is a supervisory working alliance between you and your supervisee. Methods, interventions, treatments, theories, those come last. We should help them find their own way and not force our own theoretical orientation or favorite interventions on them. Be a resource, but not a dead end where they're not free to understand what they do for themselves. Researchers' ethical responsibilities. If we are looking at those things, vulnerable parties, children, the elderly, people in nursing homes, people in prison, defects cases, foster kids, have very few rights. Their rights are considerably diminished. As researchers, we have a huge responsibility to protect them and that at no point is harm done to them. Looking at typical issues on page 77, understand what happens in professional settings as the relationships develop. What is the line between supervision and therapy? Whitaker said that it's not surprising that supervision looks like therapy. It's not that the supervisor is doing therapy, but the therapist is providing supervision. So, in preferred ideas, where our lines are, where our favorite sacred cows may live, and in gatekeeping, protecting the profession. Going forward over to chapter 5, competency and integrity. challenges for day in the future. The sub-principle related to competence and integrity, Woody, page 84. That sub-principle is 3.1. And it says, when we are developing new skills and specialty areas, we ensure competence of the work to protect clients from possible harm. There should not be a situation where a client is being exposed to experimental, unproven work. There are enough research-based, evidence-driven interventions theories out there that our clients can be sure that they are getting the scope of practice that is part of our established field. Clients are not a place to experiment on. Looking at 6 factors a therapist can rely on for clinical decision making. Again, I would refer you to the Google Classroom and to Forms and Docs. We have samples of ethical decision making models there for you across theorists, and then one that's a practical one page that you can also use. So in page 87 to 88, those 6 factors: get the facts, know what's going on, write it out, consult, collaborate with other professionals, with your professional organization, get some legal advice, brainstorm situations that will take all stakeholders into consideration, pick the best possible choice, implement it, review it, reassess it, put it into place. The next area is on page 88 to 89, an example of knowledge that should go into clinical decision making. One example of knowledge is, what do you know about the field? What do you know about the professional literature? What have you understood? What do you know about what your colleagues have been through? Someone's written on this, someone has experienced this. It should not be approached with a rigid stance unless something that has happened that's egregious. Sexual contact with clients, inappropriate physical contact, angry contact, abandonment of clients. Those things provide for a slightly different approach, but in these particular situations, you want to determine what is the consensus among your peers. Always go to supervision and consultation. Consultation is always at your peer level. Consultation is a level above you. There is always someone there who has more knowledge about a particular intervention, a particular situation than you have, just because they've experienced it. So seek those people out, people that have more experience dealing with a certain type of client population. Look for those people and get their understanding from them. If you're evaluating research literature, some of the things that you want to look for: is it peer reviewed? Is it within the last 5 years? Is it in, does it adhere to certain treatment standards? Does it apply more than 95% of the time? Does it give you guidelines or options? Guidelines 75% of the time, options approximately 50% of the time. Is it in a peer-reviewed journal by an organization that you respect? So it's not just what you found on Wikipedia or the latest thing on the internet. Go back to professional sources. Woody and Woody, page 92, looking at arguments against evidence-based practices. A slightly different situation about evidence-based practices. You want to affect the therapeutic relationship positively. You can do that with manualized treatment. You want to affect your job satisfaction, that you think that what you've done means that you're doing good clinical work. Sometimes they say it restricts innovation, creativity. As long as the intervention is processed it becomes CBT in nature. It becomes clinical and evidence-based, empirically based. What happens is, excuse me, if it only remains simply an intervention, it stays arts and crafts until the clinician is able then to research it and to establish it and be able to find a way to process it with the client. Excuse me. 3 family-based treatments for adolescents and conduct issues. Always, you can go to behaviorally based treatment, to contracts, to family roles and rules and expectations. The therapeutic implications of effectiveness research on alcohol abuse is covered in Sprinkle, and we will have that in the next chapter. So looking forward as educators, researchers, supervisors, and counselors, understanding that to be what we are clinically, that we're clinicians and that those roles mesh, but they also have to be seen separately apart when we're evaluating them, but in real practice they come together in a very much of a recursive nature. So check the documents in the drive, look at the MFT code of ethics in these things, look at the ethical decision-making processes. And we'll catch back up in the next section with Sprinkle.